we are on, and I'm recording, and I got my friend Lee Irons with me, and you should be seeing him on the screen right now if I've pressed all my buttons correctly, and that is always up in the air. You know, we never know if I've done that right. So let's just hope and pray that I'm seeing you. That's a good sign. You're in the
Looks
right
good to
box from
me.
my side. Yeah, I'm looking good to
Okay.
you. So that's all we can work with at this point. But Lee, I'm really stoked that we can get another opportunity to do this, brother. Appreciate it so much. Really
Yeah.
appreciate your time and your expertise. And I feel like every second with you, I'm sort of I can feel my brain kind of just expanding. It's like a little
All
feeling that
right.
I get. It's amazing. My job today is because we've got all sorts of awesome stuff to talk about here. We hinted at it right in the last podcast, um,
Mhm.
and in the last episode that I was with Lee, and kind of coming out of this merit work covenant of works idea, all sorts of things concerning federal theology, conditionality of the covenant, etc. And we'll try and tease that out. And Lee has given me this. You know, I was just saying to him, like, I don't even know why I'm surprised that I've got this amazing outline of everything that we might touch on in the next few episodes in front of me. Every time I ask Lee a question, I get like a diagram, I get a little reference key in the front. It's quite amazing. Lee, you know what I do want to know? I mean, I have noticed. I picked up a pattern, right? All your documents kind of look very
Uh,
systematically presented. I would give
uh,
anything to see how you store your information. That's what I would like to see one day.
so like the hierarchy of my folders in
Oh
my
man,
computer.
it must be something to check out. I mean, I just there's no ways you are disorganized with this, right? You're an organized guy,
Yeah. Well, I try. I try. I have different folders on different topics, and
and
the theology folder has 100 different subfolders, and each of those has subfolders.
I mean, so when you reference and you put all these, like, I mean, when you make a note to yourself, right, or
Yeah.
something, I mean, you obviously are doing that to be able to pull that up at a later stage with intentionality, right?
Hmm.
That is
Hmm.
how you work, or am I just or am I reading into that?
Yeah. Well, it's very helpful to keep notes and have outlines of things, and then you can use those later for different writing projects and things like that.
Yeah,
So
amazing.
yeah.
I would love to eventually get you to just teach us how to do this stuff. Just unorganized guys like myself. I mean, we just see this and we're like, wow, wow. Just give me some of that anointing. Just touch me and I'll be healed, kind of thing. You know,
Well,
that's what
in,
we're
in
looking at.
in Microsoft Word, you just hit the little button at the top that says outline mode,
See, I
and
didn't
you
even know
just
that. You know,
yeah,
wow.
right above where it says paragraph, there's bullets, numbers, and an outline. Click that arrow, multi-level list, and then you can do outlines,
And then you're
and
done. You
it's
just smack this
it's
guy out.
automatic. You don't have to.
Yeah, brilliant. And
No special tricks needed. So,
cool. Yeah, I mean, I've just kind of got onto the Evernote like revelation.
yeah,
Evernote is great for guys like me because I mean, you just tag the daylights out of it,
yeah,
and you'll find it eventually. You know, like if there's just one
yeah,
word in there, you'll get
right,
it.
right,
And
yeah.
it's saved my bacon more than once. But I would love to actually. Usually, what happens is I start out, you know, all right, here we go. Like New Year or something kicks in, and I'm like, oh, I'm just
Mhm.
gonna be Mr. Organized, you know, and I type all my stuff out nicely, and I store it, and then
Yeah,
like what month two, you know, a little bit of busyness kicks in, and it's just crazy. It's sticky notes, down to sticky notes
chaos.
everywhere on my forehead, on my bookshelves, you know, it's just walking around like I'm about to lose
Yeah.
myself. But anyways, we'll leave that for another time. We got enough to talk about. Yeah,
Okay.
what I was gonna say is my job is to try and not subtract brain power from this discussion. I'm gonna just basically uh, try and draw out what you know what
Hmm.
is important to draw out from that last discussion and some of the stuff that's on your mind at this point. And again, just really want to thank you, Lee. It's just a real privilege that you be taking us through this. So, you know, just to kind of give everyone listening, we might not get, we're going to keep this super informal and super, kind of discussion oriented. And even if for no other reason than just for my sake. But we basically are wanting to get through things like monocovenantalism versus federal theology, the law gospel contrast we mentioned last time. You've got there the broad versus narrow gospel. You've got the conditionality of the covenant, as we just mentioned, even the third use of the law and how that all fits in. So those are extremely, extremely interesting subjects. If you listen to this podcast, you are already kind of on that page, and you have been prepped for that at some level, surely. And maybe we've touched on some similar subjects, but it's exciting to be able to go through that. So why is all this on your mind at this point, Lee?
Well, I've just been doing a lot of reading lately in the whole area of covenant theology, law-gospel contrast. I recently read Herman Whittius's Economy of the Covenants Between God and Man. I recently read a book by a Scottish Presbyterian minister named John Cahoon called A Treatise on the Law and the Gospel. I'm currently reading Coxeus's treatment of covenant theology.
Yeah, so you
and
mentioned.
So all these ideas are just in my mind right now, and I'm really thinking about them. But they're also issues that are very relevant to discussions going on in the church as well, especially, debates between, those who are really emphasizing justification by faith alone and those who are concerned about antinomianism. Accusations flying back and forth that, oh no, you're a neonomian or you're an antinomian, and these kinds of issues, they're very relevant right now. And so I've been doing a lot of thinking on that, and it all boils down to, the heart of what I'm concerned about right now, and the thing that's on my mind at the moment, is really trying to understand the law gospel contrast. And trying to understand that in the right way.
Right.
And to me, it's very easy to get into bad definitions of the law gospel contrast that are too simplistic, that the law is just anytime there's a command in the Bible, the gospel is anytime there's a promise. That's too simplistic and doesn't deal with the issue of what about the Christian life imperatives? What about like in Paul's letters where you have Ephesians 4-6, I beseech you to walk worthy of the calling with which you've been called. Are these all just law? I don't think so. And so there's another debate that has come up is whether or not the call to faith and repentance, which could be viewed as commands, whether or not those are part of the law or the gospel.
Right. Yeah.
So that's what I've been wrestling with and trying to figure out. And I think I have some ideas and some thoughts that I hope are biblical and faithful to traditional Reformed theology, but that are also filled with grace and not bringing the church back under a new law.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I think this stuff is worth looking at, even though, as you say, it's been a perennial sort of thing throughout the ages. You've got so much headbutting going on. And a lot of it does come down to simplistic definitions. And it's almost like the more nuance you can put in a definition, or at least we should try and work at it to get as much together on that definition as possible, so as to allow at least the potentiality of unity where it didn't exist before, or just the ability to see one another, even if you end up disagreeing on another element. And as you said, the hot topic issue, just recently I was reading through, I don't think this was a recent article, but Mark Kohlberg, he was just saying, well, you've got, all this in-house reform stuff going on in terms of law, gospel, and the shepherd controversy, and obviously in Klein and all that. But he ended off that article saying, just look how this is expanded way beyond, like, now it's just the whole of the evangelical world, or even just beyond evangelical. You're thinking N.T. Wright, you're thinking, everyone's kind of still dealing with this, and it's almost that John Piper at a popular level. You've just got this crossroads that feels like everyone's at that crossroads. Like, we've just got to make a call on this, and so I think any work on it is good, but at least just to help people understand what they can say no to, what they say yes to, where there can be some unity, where there is apostasy even, or anathema, it's serious stuff.
Yeah.
So you start off with just thinking about, okay, monocovenantalism versus federal theology. That got my interest because when I think of monocovenantalism, I would think of it as a kind of federal theology, not something put against federal theology. But you have different thoughts there.
Yeah, that's a common problem. So I think that a lot of us are familiar with the distinction between dispensational and covenant theology.
Mm-hmm.
And then we think that, so I grew up in a dispensationalist church, and part of my process of becoming reformed was really delving into that whole issue and realizing that dispensationalism was wrong and that covenant theology was the way to go. And so it's very easy then to just think, okay, covenant theology is this one simple concept, and everyone knows what that is, and covenant theology is covenant theology, and there's no need for any further clarification.
Mm.
But as I've gotten into this myself, just studying covenant theology and studying the current debates, I've come to the realization that even that term covenant theology may be a misnomer,
mm-hmm.
because it's too broad. It's basically, if you're not a dispensationalist, that's all it means, is you're not a dispensationalist.
Right. Yeah.
But covenant theology can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And the way I simplify it is, even though there's probably, dozens of different flavors and brands of covenant theology, I want to simplify it into two main streams that are out there today. And that's monocovenantalism and federal theology, which I see as being very distinct.
Right.
So federal theology technically just means covenant theology, just using the Latin word for covenant, foedus. So federal theology just means covenant theology. But I think the term federal theology is useful in identifying a certain type of covenant theology, because it not only has the word covenant in it, federal is covenant, but it also brings to mind the two federal heads, Adam and Christ.
Which is at
so
the nub of it.
Federal theology. So federal theology is a distinct type of covenant theology that has a very clear distinction between the covenant of works with Adam in the garden and the covenant of grace after the fall.
Right.
And so it's based on this two Adam construct, that there's a contrast between the covenant of works and the covenant of grace, between Adam and Christ as the second Adam.
Right.
That is something that monocovenantalism does not have as clearly spelled out in its system. Monocovenantalism tends to deny the pre-fall covenant of works with Adam, or if it doesn't deny it completely, it changes the understanding of it so that it's not a clear covenant of works, but it's rather some sort of, it's basically a form of the covenant of grace, basically,
right.
Which Adam was called to trust and obey, just like we are. So monocovenantalism is different from federal theology. It may still be covenant theology. It's not dispensational, but it's not federal theology because it does not hold to this clear contrast between the covenant of works and the covenant of grace.
Right. Yeah.
One of the telltale signs of somebody being a monocovenantalist is that they don't like that term. I'm not really comfortable with this term covenant of works. Could we call it something else? Maybe the covenant of life, or some sort of arrangement, or maybe it's the Adamic administration, but they don't like that term, the covenant of works. And the reason they don't like it is because that concept of the covenant of works brings into view this concept of a covenant in which the reward, at least hypothetically and theoretically, it didn't happen, but hypothetically, the reward of eschatological advancement of eternal life and being confirmed in righteousness and being given a perfect and unending and unbreakable communion with God forever, is based upon doing works. It's based upon the idea of, you do the work that God commanded, and then once you've done the work, the reward is granted to you on the basis of justice. And that's what people are afraid. That's what monocovenantalists balk at. They struggle with that concept of, is it even possible that Adam could have obtained the reward on the basis of works?
Right. Yeah.
I don't like that idea.
Totally. and this is why it comes straight out of the merit conversation. I mean, this is,
Right.
exactly what you were saying, just in case,
Right.
if you are listening to this now, keep in mind, go back to that previous conversation, because that'll set you up for everything we're talking about at this point. I think I might have heard it from you at some point, but let me see how you phrase it. Something like, with covenant theology, well, what appealed to me is almost the phrase covenant theology, because it is so wide, because it is so broad. It's almost like you could keep that more along the lines of a biblical theological flavor, and then as you move into the more systematic end of the same thing, you're thinking more in terms of a federal theology.
Yes. Before you get to the whole federal system, covenant theology can be a subtopic within biblical theology, where you're simply going through all of the biblical covenants,
Right.
and doing biblical theology of the biblical covenants. So then that would mean looking at the covenant with Noah and the Abrahamic covenant,
Right.
The Davidic covenant, all of these different covenants, and then kind of exploring the different the progress of special revelation through these historical covenants that God
Right.
made, following them in historical order in the Bible. But
then you get into the systematic category,
yeah,
and it's like now you're talking about, right, well, even in the systematic category, you've got two different kinds that we really want to be making sure we're clear on moving forward.
Right. So federal theology it relies upon the biblical theology of the covenants as its exegetical basis.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it is a product of systematic theology, of taking the results of biblical theology, and formulating a broad systematic understanding of the covenants into these two broad categories of the covenant of works and the covenant of grace.
Yeah.
That is a systematic theological enterprise that rests upon the work of biblical theology.
I love the way you've always highlighted that point right throughout. I think I might have actually, that might have been very formative on me right in the beginning. And I've just appreciated it, because a lot of the flattening out of, and maybe this is, I said to Chris the other day, coming at it from a Baptist perspective, I suppose one of the initial rejections or the initial reasons I struggled with covenant theology was because it seemed to me that all that, and now we're thinking about the systematizing element and the way it's put in the confessions and those sorts of things, it tended to flatten things out without any sense of historical, biblical, theological progression. And I think I might have heard it from you at some point. Just, I love the way that you spoke about, there is there are these exegetical realities, these covenants in the Bible, and when we've got to keep that somehow in our minds apart from the systematic construct involved, which is, it's not less true or anything like that, but we're dealing with a different field. We're dealing with something that builds on, as you say. And so, again, just keeping, I like that idea, hey, let's put that all into the realm of covenant theology. A lot of biblical theologians, they're doing that, building up. But then now we're thinking about that systematizing issue. And what you're saying is that that within the realm of systematic theology, what should be covenant theology is too broad, if we're going to use that term moving into that realm, because you've got something like monocovenantalism. Essentially, you need something more defined than not just dispensational or not dispensational, which I totally resonate with. I think that's good, and especially now that when you say Reformed or I'm covenantal, a covenant theologian, or people do have federal vision wandering around in their minds at that point, and probably that might even be their first knee-jerk reaction to if it's not the supersessionist or the replacement theology, or from the dispensational debate, it's probably now more along the federal vision side of things. And
so ironically, what I'm calling federal theology is the opposite of federal
we want it back.
vision.
We're taking it back. Yeah, we're redeeming federal
vision
theology.
Would be more closely aligned with what I'm calling monocovenantalism. So so the terms are so confusing. I know, but
totally. So you got to define them.
I'm using the term federal theology though because that's the historic term. If you look it up in in systematic theological textbooks, or actually historical works of historical theology, or like the Dictionary of Scottish Church History.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be an article on federal theology or covenant theology.
Right.
So that's the term that's used for it.
Yeah, great. And I like it because, as you say, you got the federal representatives. You've got this is what it's all about. It's at the end of the day, and I like it also because when you do think about the hypothetical reality of what the first Adam, might have merited, it's you're always have in your mind, it's not just a hypothetical reality, because what you're arguing for the one, you're arguing for the other, and you're keeping what did happen in mind with what Christ did. So, again, just to throw back on what we said last time, I think that is a helpful expression. Federal theology, there we go. So we want monocovenantalism out, and we want federal theology in, and we're moving from that point. Good. All right. So now we you've got a few things here as subpoints, with the law of works versus the law of faith. It sounds like you have a few scriptures in mind to kind of work this through a little bit. Romans 3:27, Romans 4, and what have we got? Galatians 3 here as well.
Yeah. So just this idea that there's a contrast between these two covenants, the covenant of works and the covenant of grace, is really based on Pauline theology.
Mm-hmm.
That is what the reformers, not just Calvin, even goes back to Luther.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at Luther's commentary on Galatians, he is very strongly articulating what we would call a law-gospel contrast, but he's defining it in terms of the contrast that Paul makes between works and faith, between law and gospel, between inheritance by the law versus inheritance by the promise. So I just in the outline there, I just put down a number of verses that make this contrast very clear. One is Romans 3:27. Paul says, then what becomes of our boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? By a law of works? No, but by the law of faith. And so that sets up for us the contrast between these two things, the covenant of works and the covenant of grace, the law of works and the law of faith. If you turn into the next chapter in Romans 4, Paul fleshes it out even more. For example, near the beginning of chapter 4, he brings up Abraham, and he quotes that great proof text from Genesis 15:6 that Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. And then Paul does a little bit of theology here, and he says, okay, let's think about this. Verse 4, now to the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. And to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness.
Right. There we go.
I like that one because that very clearly brings in this concept of wages being counted as what is due.
Totally.
That's what we mean by this idea of the works principle. That's what we mean by a covenant based on the works principle.
Yeah.
A covenant based on the works principle is a covenant in which the reward is being given to you, not by grace, not because you trusted in God's promise. It's being given to you because you did the work that was required of you. You perfectly obeyed God and you fulfilled the requirement of that covenant. And so now the reward is being given to you as what is due. It is due to you.
Yeah.
You could even, if Adam had obeyed, he could have even come before God and said, you owe me the reward. You owe me the eschatological advancement that you promised me in the covenant of works.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting that, I'm hearing you speak there and thinking, I don't know how this works, and this will be another episode at some level, but, Lutherans and the way they don't totally accept a covenant of works prior to the fall. I'm always in awe of that a little bit, like how, because they've got such a strong law gospel contrast, and, they would amen every one of these passages that you've read to us. And really all we're talking about with covenant theology, or at least federal theology here, is the covenantal historical development of law and gospel.
Right.
And it's almost like, how does that work, with the pre-fall thing? We need to come back on that one and look at that more closely.
Yeah, so it does have effects on the Lutheran system. It affects their view that justification can be lost.
Yeah, true. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Jordan Cooper, we need to talk to you. We need to get, we need you to fix Lutheranism. No, I'm joking.
Whereas in the Reformed system, we understand that Christ, as the second Adam, has performed the works that the first Adam failed to do, and therefore he has earned the reward. And the reward that he has earned is the salvation of all of the elect, and his righteousness is now imputed to them, so that they are regarded as if they had kept the covenant, as if they had performed the work, and therefore righteousness and eternal life, which is the reward of righteousness, is due to us as a reward. And therefore it's not losable.
And that's how this thing gets into assurance and all sorts of amazingly existential places. So, got to be clear on this. And then I suppose the one text there that you've got is Galatians 3:18, which is obviously pivotal to all of this and connecting it to federal theology, right?
Yes. So Galatians 3:18 is just so helpful. And this is one of those verses that Meredith Kline hammered often.
I can imagine. Yeah.
It's so clear. If the inheritance comes by the law, it no longer comes by promise, but God gave it to Abraham by a promise.
Man, and of course, Galatians. Have you looked at David T. Gordon's book, developing all of this recently? I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I got it finally. It got shipped to New Zealand, so it took forever to get you, but it got you. And I'm looking forward to reading that. But basically, I mean, that whole epistle. Wow, just so key for all of this. All right,
he basically argues there that these terms that Paul uses, especially in Galatians, such as law, promise, faith, these terms are what he calls synecdoche. Synecdoche is where you take a part for the whole.
Yeah.
So faith is sort of synecdoche for the whole new covenant.
Yeah, brilliant.
And promise is synecdoche for the Abrahamic covenant, and law is synecdoche for the Mosaic covenant or the Sinai covenant.
Yeah.
I think that's very helpful. I think it helps to really clarify a lot of Paul's argumentation in Galatians.
Great.
Now, what's interesting is you'll notice that we've been using all of these verses in Paul that talk about the contrast between law and promise or works and faith. All these verses are verses where Paul is talking about the law that was given at Mount Sinai and the promise that was made to Abraham. And we're using that law promise contrast to systematically, now we're doing systematic theology, and we're using that as a proof text for this concept of the contrast between the Adamic covenant of works
right
and the post-fall covenant of grace. And people might be shaking their heads in that and saying, that's strange, that doesn't make any sense. Well, the reason why it makes sense is because traditional federal theology has always argued that the works principle that was enshrined in the pre-fall Adamic covenant of works was repeated in some corporate way, in some typological corporate level with Israel at Mount Sinai. And so all of the passages where Paul is talking about a contrast between works and faith, between law and promise, can be used as a systematic basis for establishing the contrast between the covenant of works with Adam and the covenant of grace with the elect after the fall.
Yeah. And we do need to do that. I was actually thinking about it the other day because, even using Klein's, whoever takes the oath, helps you determine whether it's a covenant of works, covenant of grace idea. You can see that very clearly, of course, in the Mosaic covenant. They're taking the oath and let the blood be on our heads, etc. And so they've got a covenant of works, and then, with Abraham, covenant of grace and so forth. But with, unless I'm missing something in the garden, I mean, you might argue that through God's fiat, there is an oath, sort of a word thing happening over there, that in the covenantal fabric of that whole creation process. I think you can see that easily enough, but you don't see Adam taking the oath, up front at that point. Or, I mean, is there something that I'm missing there? Do you think there is an element that you would look at to say that Adam did take the oath at some point?
Well, there's no record of it.
No.
So Genesis 1-3 doesn't make any mention of Adam taking an oath.
So we are relying on basically what we're reading into it, right?
we're relying on a number of things. We're relying on systematic theology, looking at the law-gospel contrast in Paul. We're relying also on things like, the fact that later Revelation, Hosea 6:7, looks back on the Adamic situation and calls it a covenant and says that Adam broke the covenant.
Broke the covenant, right? Yeah.
So there's a lot of factors that can be used to develop that.
Right.
For example, this is not new. The fact that a covenant is a covenant may not always be evident at the initial narration of it. For example, the Davidic covenant. When God made the Davidic covenant with David, the word covenant is not used there.
That's a great point.
There's no oath mentioned in 2 Samuel 7.
Right.
But later on in 2 Samuel 23 and Psalm 89 and so on, Psalm 132, looking back on that event, it's called a covenant. In fact, it even says that God swore an oath.
Yeah.
Even though that is not mentioned in 2 Samuel 7 at the initial act of the initial narrative.
Right.
So
the act
we're doing something similar
back.
here.
The act of reading
subsequent revelation to look back on the past.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not an illegitimate process.
Right.
I think the text you just raised there is important for that, because people go, oh, well, you can't. At some level, it's just using the new to interpret the old, right? Just using that basic hermeneutic and just reading.
And even the old itself, even in the Old Testament, there's progressive revelation that looks back and brings out the covenantal nature of it. There's even systematic theology going on in the Old Testament. For example, if you look at the Genesis narrative and you look at the covenant that God made with Abraham, that covenant is actually split up into various episodes. There's the initial covenant episode in Genesis 15 of passing between the pieces. But then there's another covenant episode in Genesis 17 with circumcision. And then after that, after Abraham dies, God renews the covenant with Isaac, and then after Isaac, he renews it with Jacob. And so if you're just looking at, if you have a purely grammatical historical method of exegesis, which I don't think is a correct method of exegesis,
but let's
if you have just that, you would have to say, well, literally, there's actually at least 2 Abrahamic covenants, and then there's an Isaac covenant and a Jacob covenant. So there's maybe 4, maybe 5 different Abrahamic covenants.
Yeah. Well, they do that too, as well. I mean,
but within the Old Testament itself, there will be places later on in Exodus and so on, looking back upon the whole patriarchal period and lumping it all together and doing systematic theology and saying that God made one promise and one oath with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's systematic theology. That's taking the plurality that you see in the text that's exegetically spread out historically over many covenants, and then stepping back and saying, let's do systematic theology here and say what's going on really is that God is making one covenant.
Brilliant. Yeah, there it is. So you do it anyway, and you have to deny a lot if you want to get out of that one. And I mean, I'm just thinking as you're talking there of I realize this is it's a big sort of area right now. It's not dispensationalism is not what it used to be, and you've had a lot of progression, and they are progressive dispensationalists. But I mean, I remember just being put off by the whole thing when, in fact, this was one of the big things when I was looking at it. I was, I remember thinking, okay, what do they do with the new covenant? Because Jeremiah is talking about the new covenant for Israel. And then Hebrews is talking about the new covenant for the church. And I was thinking, well, in my mind, I was thinking, well, you probably need 2 new covenants, if you're going to, and lo and behold, that's what they held to.
That's what they did, exactly.
And I remember
the old dispensationalists did that.
Totally. So
I think the new ones
that.
don't, but the old ones did. They were consistent. You got to hand them that.
They try to run it through. I mean, I remember thinking, okay, that was a reductio ad absurdum right there. I'm out. My eject button. And I just
exactly. The same experience as you.
Funny. Anyway, so I mean that's a great point. And in terms of so what I was driving at there in terms of just trying to take these texts as you were saying, and then all of a sudden start talking about the covenant of works in the garden. I mean, I know a lot of people do feel that well, and maybe I have Klein in view as well, with a lot of what he would state, he's sort of building on so much of these foundations. And it sounds to people like he's reading stuff into the text, like just crazy, just packing it all in there, and all these hypothetical realities, and just so speculative. And at some level, I think it's probably true that he just has a stab and goes there essentially. But I think at the basic covenantal, let's call it federal theology stuff, he's working on this paradigm. He's saying there is a legitimate hermeneutic here. We do need to read things back based on what we have, whether we want to look at it from, new, old, or the Mosaic republication element, or, however you want to look at it. There's so much to be able to give real credence to taking passages like that in the New Testament and thinking about the covenant in the garden. So, just from some of the people I've spoken to, I think that's worth highlighting. In terms of the monocovenantalism section you've got over here, do you want to sort of flesh out, because it's interesting. Actually, yesterday I had a conversation with Chris, and we were talking about the one covenant construction of A.A. Hodge, and how Klein made some comments on that, and how that's really not what we're talking. A.A. Hodge's one covenant construction is really not what we're talking about here with monocovenantalism, and yet they kind of end up doing the same thing at some level in a weird way. Did you have any comments on that?
No, not at all. I don't agree with that. So they're not doing this. Monocovenantalism, as I'm defining it, is miles apart from anything that A.A. Hodge. It's true that Klein wrote that article critiquing A.A. Hodge's construction.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that A.A. Hodge is a monocovenantalist.
No, that's what I'm saying. He's not a monocovenantalist in what you're saying. He's actually emphasizing the covenant of works.
Right. So the issue here is that within federal theology, there are two streams.
Yep.
So we've already defined this big divide between the monocovenantalists, which don't believe in the covenant of works at all, and the federal theologians that believe in the covenant of works and the covenant of grace. Now let's further subdivide those federal theologians.
Yep.
We all agree that there's a contrast between the covenant of works and the covenant of grace. So they're not monocovenantalists. They don't think that the Adamic covenant before the fall was a covenant of grace. Okay. They think it was a covenant of works in which the wages would be counted as what is due.
Yeah.
But there's a subdivision within the federal theologians between those who think that the covenant of grace, we're setting aside the covenant of works, we all agree on that.
Yep.
The covenant of grace should be viewed as either one covenant or two covenants. So the one covenant view of the covenant of grace was the view held by A.A. Hodge,
right,
who was also famously held by Thomas Boston.
Yes.
Is the view that the covenant of grace, it all boils down to with whom was the covenant of grace made?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So how you answer that question will tell you which type of federal theologian you are.
Right.
If you answer that the covenant of grace is made with Christ, then you're going to hold to the one covenant construction of the covenant of grace.
And by one covenant, we don't mean mono-covenant.
No, because we still hold the covenant of works over here. Now we're talking about the covenant of grace.
Right, totally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Monocovenantalism doesn't believe in the contrast between the covenant of works and the covenant of grace.
Yes.
So we're not denying that. We're holding to that contrast, but within the covenant of grace, some say there's only one covenant of grace and it's made with Christ.
Right.
And then because Christ is the federal head of that covenant, he represents all the elect. And so through Christ, it's made with the elect. But really, it's made with Christ. That's the view of Thomas Boston and A.A. Hodge. It's a minority view within federal theology, but it was held. This did not make these guys monocovenantalists because they still held to the covenant of works. In fact, they held to everything that's important about it because they held to this covenant of grace being made with Christ as the second Adam. And therefore, it's clear that the covenant of grace with Christ as the second Adam has a works element built into it, and that Christ's obedience meritoriously fulfills that covenant and is given to the elect.
Now,
but the majority, go ahead.
So what I was going to ask you on that point, and this is kind of, I just thought it was interesting where Klein went with it. I'd never really even pieced that together, because I suppose exactly what you were saying there in that, if anything, always struggle to say the double A Hodge, is he's friend, not foe, precisely for that
Right.
reason, because he's a
Right.
big covenant of works guy, right?
Right. Right.
And yet, what I started seeing when reading those comments that Klein makes is that you've got this covenant of redemption, which is of course a covenant of works. It's operating on the works principle, as Christ is doing the work that
Right.
Adam failed to
So
do.
you just brought up now the other view. So that's this other view within federal theology, which holds that the covenant of grace is made with the church.
Yes,
And
exactly.
therefore, there's another covenant called the covenant of redemption that is distinct from the covenant of grace.
Yes. So that would be the threefold sort of scheme, right? So
right.
if you don't have that, if you only have the twofold scheme, the
right.
AA Hodge scheme, what I've and this is where I'd like you to hear what you have to say about this, but it sounds like you have to necessarily collapse the covenant of redemption and the covenant of grace together into this one temporal sort of outworking.
In effect, what they're saying is that the covenant of grace is the covenant of redemption.
Yes.
That's all they're saying.
What's interesting about that, though, is that you're basically, it sounds like Klein was not liking the fact that you're essentially mushing together a works and a grace principle, which even though they're not doing it in the same way that a monocovenantalist would do it, it still ends up with the same problem that Klein doesn't like. The same problem exactly,
but it's not the same problem because they're not confusing law and gospel.
Okay, yeah.
But it's just that, and all Reformed theologians, for example, Turretin, Hodge, everybody who has talked about this debate, this is an in-house debate within federal theology between saying the covenant of grace is distinct from the covenant of work or covenant of redemption, saying it's the same. Everybody has acknowledged that it's an in-house difference of formulation only and not of substance.
Cool. So when you've got the Lord and servant, Christ as Lord, Christ as servant, the church receiving grace, where Christ is doing the works. You're saying it's just when you're trying to mush it all together, making one covenantal hash, as Klein put it, even though it's confusing and difficult, it's not an actual war with the antithesis of grace and works. It's more just how do we make that antithesis?
Right.
How do we get it on paper?
What is the best way to come up with conceptual clarity?
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. So what I'm going to just mandate at this point, anyone who listened to yesterday's podcast, we were talking to Chris, listen to this as well, and I'll try and put them together and make sure people get that on the show notes, because that's helpful clarity there. We sort of left with that question mark on that show.
The thing is that there's a weakness with what Klein is calling the one covenant construction, which is really the two covenant construction, covenant of works, covenant of grace.
Exactly.
Okay.
And we need to retitle that thing.
So the two covenant construction of federal theology, where there's only the covenant of works and the covenant of grace, and the covenant of grace is being defined as a covenant made with Christ.
Yes.
And therefore it's being defined as if it were the covenant of redemption.
Mm-hmm.
The drawback of that view is that it has it doesn't do a very good job of explaining then how do we as Christ's people fit into this covenant.
Right. Yeah, totally.
And is that covenant made with us in some way? And they would say, yes, it is made with us, but only indirectly because it's made with Christ. And then Christ represents us as the elect. And so it's made with us through Christ.
Mm-hmm.
But then that raises the question of, so then is there anything on our part that we need to do? Do we need to have faith or repentance? And this is going to get into the very thing we're going to talk about.
I was about to say, yeah.
Are there any conditions that we have to keep?
Yeah.
And what about, if you're Presbyterian, what about children of believers who are in this covenant but are not elect? How do they fit?
Yeah.
So what they end up doing is they end up saying, and many of them, like Thomas Boston, will end up saying that the covenant of grace has two aspects to it.
Right.
There's the aspect of it that's made with Christ, and there's the aspect of it that has to do with the administration of it for the church.
Right.
And so they end up holding to a 3-covenant view, and
Right.
they end up in practice holding covenant of works with Adam in the garden, covenant of redemption with Christ as the second Adam, and then covenant of grace with the church.
Yeah.
Even though they want to take those second two and combine them into one, they end up recognizing that there has to be at least two different aspects. There has to be some aspect of it that connects to us as God's people.
Yeah, that's good.
So,
is that what Hodge did as well with the aspect thing?
I don't remember. It could be.
Yeah, it'd be interesting.
Yeah.
I know Klein did mention something there, but yeah, that's helpful. And that functionally they end up in the same place anyway, which I think helps to clarify the point that they're not on the, again, the thing that we're sort of against here with the monocovenantal side of things, where they are actually wanting to say that law and gospel, faith and works, that they're not different principles. And so, yeah, that's a different team. Good. Awesome. Hey, you're basically verging on that conditionality of the covenant. I see it's kind of right at the end of what you got to. I'm like, I want to get to the treasure.
It's right there in our peripheral vision.
Yeah, I mean, look, I love that discussion because it's so important and so I mean, everyone asks that question, whether you have looked at covenant theology or not. Really, you're asking, what do I need to do here? And so let's get there the way you want to get there, though. What's next? What do you want to kind of deal with next as you look through this outline?
Okay, well, let's go ahead and just go through the outline. So let's talk about the law-gospel contrast now. So of this discussion about federal theology versus monocovenantalism is to set the context for us to be able to properly define the law-gospel contrast.
Yeah.
The monocovenantalists reject the law-gospel contrast.
Yeah.
They say that one example of a monocovenantalist that I recently was looking at was Robert Letham in his new systematic theology.
Yeah.
And in his chapter on the covenant of works with Adam, he rejects the idea that it's a covenant of works. He prefers to call it a covenant of life. Remember, that's the telltale sign.
Yeah.
As soon as they reject that label, covenant of works, you know something's amiss. Sure enough, he doesn't like that term. He wants to call it a covenant of life instead. And he says that in that covenant with Adam before the fall, grace constitutes and law regulates.
Right.
And that this pattern, grace constitutes, law regulates, holds for every era of, we can't say redemptive history because we want to include the pre-fall situation. It holds for every era of God's history of his covenant relationship with mankind, before the fall, after the fall, at all times.
Yes.
Grace is what constitutes the relationship, and law only comes in to regulate that relationship and say, this is how you should live. This is the response that we should have to God's grace.
Right.
So this idea of monocovenantalism, it rejects the law-gospel contrast.
Yeah.
It's saying that law is actually a part of grace, that law is gracious. Grace is primary. Law simply comes in secondarily, in a secondary way, to regulate the relationship. And
this is John Frame's big
theology
thing as well, I think.
Yep, John Frame. He was definitely influenced by Norman Shepherd. Norman Shepherd had the same view. This whole idea that there is no law-gospel contrast, that law-gospel are on a continuum. Daniel Fuller's book had that title in it. Gospel contrast or continuum. He was saying no contrast, and he was rejecting this covenant of works, covenant of grace contrast, and saying instead it's a continuum. But federal theology says no, there is a law-gospel contrast, and that follows directly from this idea of the covenant of works versus the covenant of grace. And it also sets up for understanding what is the gospel. The gospel is that Christ, as the second Adam, has fulfilled the obedience and satisfied the wrath of God for us because of the broken covenant of works. So in other words, you could say, in a simplistic way, Christ has fulfilled the covenant of works.
Right.
It's a little bit simplistic because really he fulfills the covenant of redemption, but the covenant of redemption has a works principle built into it, and Christ fulfills it as the second Adam. So the reason that I wanted to give this whole context of federal theology is because I wanted us to have that law-gospel contrast properly situated within a covenantal context. And to me, this is the key that helps to avoid bad definitions of the law gospel contrast.
Yeah.
And also to answer the monocovenantal denial of the law gospel contrast.
Right.
So it answers the bad monocovenantal. We already dealt with that.
Yes.
That's clear. It answers that. But it also provides a response to bad definitions of the law gospel contrast.
Okay, good. Yeah.
For example, one bad definition that I hear a lot is that the law gospel contrast is that anytime you find a command or an imperative in the Bible, that's the law. And
right.
in contrast with that, the gospel is simply the announcement that Christ has been crucified and risen.
Right.
And both of those definitions are off. The first definition, law is any command or imperative, is really bad, because then what do you do about all the Christian life imperatives in the Bible? What do you do about all the call? What about the call to believe in Christ?
Right. Yeah. Well, you know, and
it's a command.
You say that. I mean, that's exactly what. That's. I don't know if you've ever read Frame's critique of you know, just, well, I suppose he's done so much of it over the years, but basically, this is one of his big areas. He looks at that, exactly what you've just said, and says, well, how can this be? You know, because you've got more complexity than that. And so, yeah, it'd be interesting to see what you say about that, to at least work through Frame's own critique. And at some level, you're just taking that critique seriously and going, okay, well, you know, let's think about that.
That's not the definition. He's attacking a straw man. The law gospel contrast is not command versus the objective work of Christ.
Right.
Even the objective work of Christ is not, that is not a bad definition of the gospel, but even that is a little bit too narrow.
Too narrow, right.
What about the call to believe in Christ?
Right.
Does that fit under the law or the gospel? I don't think it fits under the law, and it does fit under the gospel. So therefore, you can't make the gospel simply the objective announcement of what Christ has done outside of you to the exclusion of our response. Shouldn't our response also be a part of the gospel?
Exactly.
So, but you see how we can resolve these bad definitions, and we can clearly see that they're wrong once we have a federal theology context in place, because now we see, what is the law? The law is the covenant of works. So it's not just any command.
Yes.
It's any command that is founded upon the works principle,
right,
in which a reward is being granted to you as what is due because of your obedience to that command.
Totally. Would it be?
That's the works principle.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, and so are we talking, just to see if I'm on the same page here and if I'm tracking with you, you're basically saying, instead of thinking about it in terms of that isolated law and promise thing, you're really talking about the principle of inheritance, so to speak. You know, exactly. How will you get it? Is it going to be via the works of another, or and then
Galatians,
you know, and then you've got right, exactly. Which you know,
does
now
the
that
inheritance come by the law,
right,
or does it come by the promise?
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
And you know, that is just so big. I think if you just simply take that, you know, endpoint and just measure that against so much of the critique that I've read anyway of a law gospel contrast, it's like they're falling into that straw man trap every time with all their critique. They're just constantly critiquing the wrong thing. They're never critiquing the actual the principle of inheritance itself, which is you know, it's just very helpful to know that when you do read through these things. Because it just, you know, otherwise it throws you and you just end up muddled and confused and
Right. And you don't want to say that all of the Christian life imperative passages like Romans 6, you know, consider yourselves dead to sin and alive to God, you know, put to death your members which are on the earth, you know, you've been raised with Christ, seek the things which are above, Colossians 3, you know, that whole section in Ephesians 4 and 5, you know, all those imperatives about, you know, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. we don't want to say that all of that is law.
Right. But we are saying it's imperative, though, right? So, and I think
It is.
there's indicative
It is.
imperative, and we're
Yep.
saying there's almost like a theological category of law that we're looking
Mhm.
at here. Maybe there's a better way to put that, but because I think where I feel like I might have been confused is, I mean, how can it not be law? It's imperative, but it's almost like there's more to it, is what you're saying. There's law as a law inheritance principle.
Because it depends on whether this imperative is situated within a covenant of works or a covenant of grace.
Yeah, brilliant. That's so helpful. Yeah.
That's why the federal context is so important. If the imperative is situated within a covenant of works, then it's law. But if it's situated within the covenant of grace, it's not law. Now, I wouldn't say it is the gospel either.
Right.
Because the gospel is that Christ died for our sins and rose again from the dead, 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4. But it fits under the covenant of grace. And so it's part of the gospel. It's an implication. Those Christian life imperatives, Romans 6, Ephesians 4-5, Colossians 3, they are imperatives that flow from the indicatives of the gospel. They're implications of the gospel for how we should live.
Yeah. Very helpful. You know what I'm thinking? Just in light of this discussion leading up until this point, this might be a good point. I realize we're kind of halfway through your law gospel contrast outline here, but it's just such a great point to end on in terms of, if someone listens to this and gets to that point of clarity, that would be amazing. And provides a solid foundation for where you want to go as far as I'm looking at it over here as we pick it up in the next episode. Just mindful we're getting a little bit on for time. But what do you think? Is there anything else to close with, or do you think that sounds like a good plan?
I think that's great. So I think the key thing here, the bottom line conclusion of all this is you have to define the law gospel in terms of federal theology.
Yeah.
The law is the covenant of works. Do this and live. Perfect obedience is required. If you provide that perfect obedience, the reward is due to you as a matter of justice. There's also a curse involved, right? Curse is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law to do them.
Right.
The gospel, by contrast, is the covenant of grace, that Christ has done it all for you so that you might live. You don't do it in order to live. Christ has done it so that you might live. And then because you live, this is how you should walk in obedience to the Lord. Now, that second part about how you should walk in obedience, that's not the gospel, but it's an implication of the gospel.
Right.
In the context of the covenant of grace.
Yeah. And, I think that's such a helpful way to respond to someone who is struggling with, because we're talking about receiving it on this end, the critique, but I know a lot of people who would struggle with a law gospel contrast are also sort of themselves processing at quite, whether it be an initial level or they're trying to work through it. Perhaps that's their tradition. Perhaps that's just the way they've always thought about it. And I think if they're getting simplistic answers on this as well, someone's just holding to a very simplistic definition or maybe an incorrect, or as you put it, you're a terrible definition of law, a terrible or not bad definition of gospel. I mean, they're obviously not going to want to yield on their view as well. They're not even going to be interested. But if you're able to kind of broaden it out and show them exactly why it is that you feel this way and how it accounts for all the knowledge, all the imperative and indicative, all the info, I think that's so much more compelling and just worthwhile thinking about. So again, hopefully that is helpful to someone listening in on this, and if not for yourself, then for a conversation you might be having with someone, which someone usually is having, if my experience is anything to go by.
Very true.
Yeah. Oh man. All right. Well, thanks a million, Lee. Really appreciate that time.
Thank you.
Realize it took a chunk out of your day there. But thank you. Thank you so much for being willing to do this. And I'm looking forward to taking another chunk some other time.
Sounds good.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to play out at this point. Let's see if I can do this with my immense slickness. Here we go. Are we ready? Yes, we are.